Shortly after publishing this video, some people had questions for me about how I did certain effects, so I thought before I deleted everything related to this project, I should make a director's commentary about what I did right, what I did wrong, what things were a pain in the ass to do, and how they were done. But starting with the gameplay, all the clips are from the customs browser, which some people noted that there are unusual clips in here, and that's because everything in here is quite old, bar maybe one or two of them. And that's because I don't really play Halo much anymore. So my gameplay that I've been editing down into highlights and mini-tages are just to clear out storage space and be done with Halo. The first concept I remember someone asking me about was probably this outline effect where you can see him through the wall before I do the pre-fire snipe. So I will hop into Fusion and show how that was done. And it looks quite goofy before actually post-processing everything. But I simply went into a Forge canvas, created a little L-shaped room of a green screen, and used the third-person camera to get a stabilized shot to have something center frame that I could easily create a matte out of and therefore an outline. So I cropped it because again, it was already pre-stabilized in engine and I didn't have to process all those extra pixels. And because this is Fusion, it doesn't have a general sequencing timeline, so I have to add a time speed node to push the actual footage later in time to take place where I need it to in my intended footage. And then I chroma keyed it, added an erode dilate node to contract the actual key itself over a matte control. And this is basically merging two mattes together. So the shrunken, or which did I do? I expanded it in this case. So I expanded the matte and then used like a Boolean over the default matte so that it created just the outline for the delta between them. And then I piped that into a background node. This background used the same color as the sniper HUD that you can see here. I just did a color picker and matched it on there so it looked very HUD native. And then I transformed it. The transform was just an offset over a tracker. The tracker is taking everything on this point and transforming it over that. And the DVE node is used to give it a little skew because realistically the guy wasn't walking straight from right to left. He was walking at an angle. So I know it skews the image incorrectly, but it got the point across. And that's it. I just merged that over and you have the end result. The next item of interest, I guess I'll mention this too. I am very lazy with a lot of my simple videos and I'll just do a lot of defocus stuff. So there's a lot of instances of basic motion tracking and using a feathered mask and defocus. So here, for example, I put a tracker on here, created an offset to center it with an ellipse mask, feathered it out, and then it's just over some lens blur. And this just gives you some time where there are breathing points between synced shots that add focus to the subject before they're taken care of. But the actual point of interest here is this transition. So this is a 3-part matte, which I tried to make it as easy for myself as possible by using a locked off shot. I promise it's not as complex as this composition makes it out to be, but what goes on here is we start with a luma keyer. The luma keyer is meant to isolate that component as the first thing that would drop in, and then I color corrected it to vaguely match the color profile of Vertigo, which is a very like warm color tone matched with green background. So I just pushed it in that direction. And then I converted that into a mask and added an exclusion matte so that it will be held out from this mask here as part 2. I merged these components together so that it smoothly transitions into a point where there's nothing in the background, and it actually fades into having this in place. And then from there, I have a third matte that takes care of the other object here. So I have my mask on the bottom. It is being transformed over time, same thing, and then is merged on top. And then there is a magic mask applied to this other silly little section. I hope nobody noticed. I didn't see any comments about it. When the camera actually snaps POVs, there is a little artifact that you can get sometimes, which is where the Spartan's body will be detached from the hip and just floating there. So you can see it here. It starts to emerge. These few frames need to be isolated in some way so that this is not appearing, because even though it's very fast, I don't want people to see that. So I applied a magic mask to get a quick roto. I expanded the matte a little bit just to be slightly overkill. And then I did a really lazy clean plate fill-in. I didn't bother with like proper object removal, because at that speed, combined with some directional blur to mesh it in a little, and then the actual motion blur on top of the final render, you're not really going to see it. And from there, I just merged it all together, continue snapping into the first perspective, and those few frames are covered. The shadow didn't really matter to me because it was complete, and it's not just some random object laying out there, but even then, I think it's very fast and most people would not have noticed it. I will mention I had some real challenges trying to retime these clips, because even after the stable release of DaVinci Resolve 21, Blackmagic Design introduced a new retime curve system. So we have in here, there's retime speed and retime frame. They've now settled on separating how they work, where there is a legacy mode and I guess you would call it a modern mode. Retime frame is the one that uses the modern system, and retime speed uses the legacy version that was introduced in version 21. So I now have everything retimed the way I wanted using the legacy mode, because I used retime speed personally. But the retime frame mode was applied to retime speed, and they changed it 3 different times throughout the time that I was working on this project. So I had to redo it 3 different times. Now that they've stabilized that feature set, I shouldn't have that problem going forward, but who knows? This transition, I remembered somebody commented on it. So first of all, my camera work was not perfect on here. I do not use dolly cam tools because none of them work on Linux yet, or at least I have not been able to get it to work. So for a single frame, I use an optical flow tween so that it's not so abrupt. And that little optical flow tween got me close enough to where you don't see the artifacting unless you're really pixel peeping, and you get a smooth transition. But transitioning out from here, I just took the fog from Guardian and used that as a means of hiding the transition with a cross dissolve and a Gaussian blur. And into the next clip, I retained the same color of fog and I wiped it away with a depth matte. So I go in diffusion again. I just used a depth map from Resolve. I did not have a theater file to do a perfect depth map with something like reshade. So this is created all in post, but it's close enough. I just convert this depth map into a bitmap and then use a newer tool called AI Cinematic Haze, which really is just like a 3D noise pattern. But it also has a built-in depth map effect. I've noticed a lot of these quote unquote AI features that Resolve has added ends up having native depth map features baked in, and it's way slower than if you generate your own depth map with a singular node instance and then pipe that into the alpha input. So I'm not sure what's going on there, but as a general workflow tip to anybody else using these tools, use your own depth map and then pipe it in when it gives you the option. You can see I just matched the color and then I wiped the depth map over time so that it would look like the fog is being pushed away as time goes on. Next editing concept, I guess, was this little motion track motion graphics animation I did on the Kiltastrophe. It's very simple. I mean, you guys have seen me do this all the time. I take a planar tracker. When it loads, there we go. I take a planar tracker. I get my planar data. I have it transformed to offset. I color corrected it to desaturate it a little. It was just too punchy against all the gray on this map. And I started off with the Kiltastrophe medal, which was very low resolution, so I did super scale it, and it looks kind of ugly, but combined with the motion blur and being farther away from the camera, so to speak, it doesn't look so bad in the end. It doesn't help that I'm usually working with 4K footage or 1080p footage that's been upscaled. For example, this clip was actually 1080p, but I super scaled it to 4K. And so whenever I have low resolution assets, I have to also upscale them so they don't look really crusty. I added a little bit of a thematic consistency change with this part of the song. If you listen, there is a change in the instrumentation. All those glissandos of the guitar, and it takes over the vocals instead. I felt like doing something to tie the clips together that are in this portion of the song. So I just threw on a lens reflection throughout it. It's subtle, but there. And you can see this bleed over into the other clip as well. But I guess I'll talk about this effect. Someone misinterpreted this as a light ray effect, but that is not the case. So I'll explain how I did this here. I once again took a luma keyer just to isolate the brightest portions of the map, and then I used this dent effect. Keep in mind there's two of them. If you search for dent, you can see there's multiple ones, and I couldn't even tell you which one I used here. You'll just have to look for it. But the mode is kaleidoscope, and I use that to bring in the image like a pulling effect, and then fade it out a little bit as it got like overly intense. Because when you bring the parameter in too far, it will start to warp backwards into a spherical shape, hence the kaleidoscope. And then I just mask that over with a magic mask to use the sniper as an exclusion matte because I wanted it to be further away from the camera. So that's all that was. Here you can see the lens reflection is still present. It's even lighter on here because the map is very bright and it was amplifying it too much. Aside from that, I also have this gun game clip. This angle, thank you to Ultravis for helping me with this. He's the body actor on it. I made the mistake of not putting Pestilence on there because I wasn't sure when we were recording. So there's a little continuity error in that. And for this, the song changes again a little bit in tone, and so I decided to throw a vignette over it. The vignette is keyframed over time, starting on this angle before it snaps to first person. This was a real pain to do audio work for because almost none of the sound bites required were in Silly Goose's sound pack, which myself and just about everyone in the Halo editing scene is very dependent on. Thank you, Silly Goose. But he did not have concussion rifle explosions. He did not have the plasma turret or the chain gun turret without doing the full burst and an overheat. In this case, there was no overheat, so I had to record my own. Same thing for the focus rifle and something else I'm not remembering. But point is, I had to go in and record a lot of that audio myself, unfortunately. But I finished that off. And there was this effect too. This is simply a magic mask, because masking is so easy nowadays with the technology we have. And I use this matte to add motion trails. And I just staggered it out by a length of 5 frames. And I panned it, which is basically just a transform offset, a little bit to the right. And the logic I used for how far to take it is I wanted it to keep spawning in right at the corner of the wall here. So it looked like for a few moments, it would just be going on forever. No motion tracking was required though. That was just manual like offset and trail length. And then eventually it stops and then, collapses into a keyframe of 0 trail length. For the focus rifle here, I actually threw the lens reflection back in just because I thought it looked nice. This transition here worked out a little differently than I expected. What I did always plan to do was this doorway type thing here to transition out of one of these. However, I originally wanted to do this one over here. I just couldn't get the recording as smooth as I wanted and centered the way I was hoping for. Because again, I don't have dolly cam tools. But as I went through a few iterations, I realized, oh, this doorway actually worked quite well. But the animation itself is always what I had intended. So I'll show you how I did this in Fusion. Quite simple, really. I thought I was going to have to motion track this, do a little stabilization sandwich with a planar tracker, and then do manual roto and animate the doorway, quote unquote, down. But really, Magic Mask actually had it covered. I was surprised because normally the edges are very flickery, and it is, but only at a point where I considered it to be okay. And I'll explain that in a moment. But here, the Magic Mask isolated exactly what I needed to. And I had 2 copies of the bitmap, which again, I booleaned out. So I had one version that was a positive on the doorway and then a negative on the, I guess the portion of the doorway that would be sliding down. And it's just a little trick to make it look like it was being animated down. But really, that's just applied as a mask. You can see that the door is not actually sliding the whole image down. I'm simply sliding down a mask because none of the data here is actually being translated. It's simply the shape that is. And the reason why I was able to get away with Magic Mask here is, in the end, you can see the edges being not perfect are a little more prominent, but it reminds me a little bit of, like, when you go through some magic portal doorway thing in some video game, it has those like wispy edges. It kind of looks like that as you get close to the end of the doorway here. So I'll show you. You see how it's got that little animation of almost a plasma thing? It's an inaccuracy of Magic Mask. That's not something I intended originally, but I thought it looked nice. So I guess error by design. I kept that in. And then for the next clip, I used a glow that used the same color as the initial pseudo doorway and keyframe that out over time just as a compositing blend thing. There's this little doorway highlight. That's just a planar track. And then again, I applied a roto shape and a glow. I don't think I have to cover that in Fusion. I don't think anyone spotted this because I kind of fucked up the implementation. So this was done before the Killtastrophe motion track on the other Reach clip. And it didn't really show up well because I forgot that I was working with 60 FPS clips and a 30 FPS timeline. So when you go into Fusion, you have access to the full set of frames, which means that I thought I had twice the amount of frames of visibility than I really did. So when I went back into the edit timeline, I'm like, oh, you can barely see this. It's like there and gone way too fast before you can register it. So what I actually did was I took this gyro, animated it onto the floor underneath the player, and then faded it out. So I guess I'll go over what I did with that though. Obviously there's the metal here, but this was then used as a mask and then transformed over here as an offset over the planar tracker. Now the planar tracker, I just used the overlay blend mode to make it show the detail underneath. Magic Mask was put on the player really roughly, so it could be placed on top of the metal. And the introduction of this was just a little motion graphics thing where you expand from 0 and bring it out to full scale. And then I faded it out with this fast noise pattern so that it would dissolve. But that's already kind of done quickly within Fusion, and I have half of that time because there's only half of the frames available in the edit page timeline and in the final render. So you don't even see that happen. Thankfully, I finally got Halo Checkpoint Manager working on Linux, which means that I can do third-person camera work in Halo 1 and Halo 2. That was a limitation I had back when I did To the Pain, and I had Xander, Tricchio, and Broe help me record those angles because I couldn't run the software on my system. So that's solved now. But this was going to be a two-part transition, and I guess I should say this is a two-part transition. It was going to be a three-part transition. So if you listen to the lyrics, he says here above the clouds. So I was going to do this almost like We Have This Bitter Earth by Crate at Home transition, where I go into space, and then there was some method of transitioning into an aerial view above the clouds, either on Orbital or Valhalla. And then the cloud overlay could be used as a mask to wipe into doing a camera that snaps from third person aerially into first person in this clip. But I got lazy and did not do that. So instead, I just used an additive blend mode to isolate the bright portions of the space clip to overlay onto the first person footage here. And then, whatever, I just faded it out. It's much more boring and much less lyrically thematic, but whatever. It's my video. No one was paying me to do it, so who gives a shit? And then I guess the whole star transition kind of tied into the next effect that took place. So this star thing, I didn't even have to do anything with it, but it would have been a pretty easy particle animation to do in Fusion, honestly. But this is a newer overlay that either came out in version 20 or 21, hence the name Starfield, very relevant. And all I did was take the stars, modify the amount of them. I, animated it to come towards the camera a little bit and then added a bunch of motion blur. Really, that's it. I didn't have to do much else. Okay, this doorway transition was like one of the last things I did because I hate myself and do the worst things for no reason. So, I mean, you've seen this all the time, right? You do a doorway transition to lead into another clip, whatever. The problem is this doorway is such a complex shape that it was such a pain to mask. So I like to motion track things to automate them as much as possible, because really when you're doing roto, you're supposed to break things into non-moving shapes as much as possible. I know a lot of times we can get lazy and use things like Roto Brush or Magic Mask and just slap it on there and be like, okay, it's done. But when you're masking a doorway for a transition, you have to be very accurate. So you can't just call it a day. And tools like that don't have a concept of what a doorway is. They are taking contrast boundaries to determine where an object begins and ends. Well, when I take a look at the floor here, where does that boundary end? It doesn't. It doesn't have a good concept of, oh, I want to isolate this, especially when the other side is occluded from this perspective. So it really just can't do the job. Trust me, I tried. So here's what I had to do instead. I tried to finally automate the process of masking a doorway because you cannot do it with point trackers. Sort of. I'll get to that later. Because they are occluded the moment that they get around the object, and you can't really offset them correctly when they don't have perspective data. To get perspective data, you can use a planar tracker, but a planar tracker needs to be coplanar with the surface. Here's the problem with that. If you look here, what is coplanar with this? This tiny little surface here? That's not nearly enough data to get an accurate planar track to then skew across the doorway's entire width and height. So that couldn't be done. So what I did instead is I took a 3D camera tracker and I generated a virtual camera path that reconstructed the motion of my camera in game. And then I used what is called the locator 3D node. I think in Nuke, they call this like a reconcile 3D node. And what this basically allows me to do is if I click make renderable, which I'm not going to do because then it has to re-render this in the edit page, and I don't want to do that. But it will show a little star on the page, and you can essentially do a manual solve for this. So the point that I could use here, for example, I would create a locator 3D. You could position it on the X and the Y axis and then temporally solve it by going a few frames over to create displacement. And then you can correct it with the Z axis as long as the target is set to the camera, because then it'll still be facing the camera and it'll go straight towards it. And when you do that, you've done a manual solve for a 3D position in a 2D axis. And I did that on all 4 corners of the doorway. So that resulted in me having 4 locators, which can simulate perspective. So then I was able to render that out into a doorway mask, which was used with this corner positioner. So this corner positioner is tied by expressions to the locator 3D nodes that I had set. So you can see all these are paired with these published keyframes. Now here's the other downside. The corner positioner is set up on a doorway that is not actually rectangular. It is whatever the hell kind of shape you want to call this. So then I had to create an even more strange set of occlusions and inclusions for my mask. So here's the original corner position with this doorway, which you can't actually see all of it because it only fits this 16:9 domain aspect ratio. But I had to eyeball it based on the preview to make it fit. And then it just kind of worked. It was a very bad workflow. Realistically, I should have inverted my corner pin data, stretched it to the full 16:9 domain, and then worked on it from there so that it would be in the proper aspect ratio instead of just like eyeballing it with an offset. It was horrible. But anyways, I have the bitmap here to merge this with a mask inclusion. So this says, okay, the doorway can exist within this area, and then an exclusion that says don't exist in this area. And this is just a bunch of Boolean operators, which is merged into another Boolean operator for the occlusion of this object here. It starts to cut into it. So I took this and had to manually mask it. I had this and had to manually mask it because, you know, that wasn't a very planar trackable either. And then the mask inclusion, I also had to do this. Now, this begs the question, did the 3D camera track really help me mask the doorway at all? Yes, because I didn't have to do the right side of the door at all. And also, it did half of the composition for me. So even though I had to do all this extra work, it was still less work than doing the whole thing, moving each anchor point every single frame. Arguably, could I have done some of these by pairing their center points with manual point trackers individually? Maybe. I haven't tried that workflow yet, but this was my first attempt at trying to automate a doorway roto. Unfortunately, I picked the worst door ever to do it with. So just as a little word of advice, there are multiple approaches, but this one might not have been the best one for this particular one. There was just a small bit of compositing on the other end of this. Because the perspective of this door is slightly rotated, I rotated the other footage and used a blur to defocus it until it came into frame. And I didn't try to like perfectly match it or anything. I think I just took like negative 25 degrees and then keyframed it with an ease to this point, and then it worked. You know, it didn't have to be exact. I used a lot of flicker here to visually accompany the extra percussion that takes place here, because it's kind of like a mini drum solo. And I didn't want to have like heavy flashing, but I just found that the flicker at the speed of 2 is almost perfectly tempo mapped with the percussion going on here. So I would just turn it on and off whenever there were percussive hits taking place. So I'll play through it and you can look for that. And additionally, there's just some other accenting effects like glows and zooms and whatever. You know, I really didn't do much in terms of effects in this video because, again, I didn't care. It's just for me. No one's paying me to make it. And I am kind of weird about this. Normally, I shouldn't be, really. I'm so opposed to doing jump cuts for no reason, even though they're great. I think when other people do them, they look great. When I do them, though, not so much. But I decided to not do a dissolve in this transition and let the viewer be slightly distracted by the idea of switching weapons, and then you switch back into the weapon on the next clip. I don't know if that actually worked for anybody to like lead your eye into that so it was less jarring of a jump cut, but that logic worked for me, so I stuck with it. This is just another defocus, magic mask, and then another ellipse mask tracked to his helmet and then offset to the body. It's another Boolean, so that includes both, and it's keyframed. I don't think I need to go over that in Fusion. This was my little RGB shift plugin I've used in the past. I think I mentioned it into the pane. I do need to update it though, because the performance on it is kind of shit. This was actually just a matter of experimenting with, well, once again, same masking logic I've talked about before with a defocus. However, I've never really like cranked out all the settings on the lens blur effect before, and that's pretty much all I did here. I had the blur size went all the way up to 10 on this, and I did rotate it over time. I honestly think I should have made it rotate a little faster, but I just mapped it to time multiplied by 3. So for each frame, it'll go 3 degrees, or I should say, you know, the offset will be based on the current time as well, which this is an adjustment clip, so the composition starts at 0 anyway. But I don't feel like the rotation was noticeable enough. I should have made it like 4 or 5 maybe. But yeah, the apodization parameter and the catadioptric, honestly couldn't even tell you what that word means, but they add a bit of like an exclusion mask to the shape itself, whereas normally the highlights are bloomed and filled in. So I kind of liked that like open hexagonal shape to it when I brought these as far out as I could. These last 3 angles were also a little more technical than they should have been. I will say this effect didn't turn out how I wanted from my own idea. This idea of putting it here actually came from Ultravis as well. He recommended it when I was showing him a preview of a render. I was just going to do a lazy planar track. First, I thought maybe planar tracking this surface and then having the text like out here so it was offset, but the track wasn't good enough to offset it, so it was very wobbly and ugly. And then I tried down here and I just thought it looked way too boring. So Ultravis said, oh, well, why don't you motion track the monitor thing over here? I said, sure, why not? So I combined that with a rack focus as well because I thought that looked nice. So the idea was that in the end of this clip, you can see I kill this guy, and this always looks at the closest player, if you didn't know. So once I kill him, it looks at me, and then when I'm turning here, I just wanted to match that in third person for continuity. So it's looking at me, I'm going into the doorway, and the focus should be me because for continuity, that's what we are focusing on to blend the two together. And then as it passes over time, it will turn away from me and go into the text. So that's what a rack focus is you're changing your focus from one point to another. Here, I'm just creating an inversion of it. To demonstrate how I did that though, it's not too hard. Again, I promise this looks more complicated than it is, but I just had to isolate a few elements based on depth because I tried using an actual depth mat in post and it just wasn't accurate enough. And again, I couldn't do a perfect 2-pass with the theater because I don't have dolly cam. So I isolated the wall with magic mask, and then I also took the background here as a gradient to do like a faux depth map, because a depth map just maps luminance ranges in grayscale to distance. And so black means it's not applied, white means it is applied fully. And then anything in between is a partial implementation of whatever it's being piped into. So this is being used as a mask to fade it out. And then that faded out mask is eventually piped into this blur. But the two are combined with a magic mask here. And this is just to include the monitor, obviously. I wanted to be careful about adding a blur down here, but there's some inaccuracies in this magic mask. You can see it like flicker kind of towards the edge, but it's good enough to where you don't really notice that much. I also had planar tracking going on because I wanted to stabilize this portion so that I could put my text on it. I didn't want to do it with a corner pin like I normally do because it's not really a 1x1 shape and it's not a wide wall. So instead I did what I usually call a tracker sandwich. So I steadied it and then I unsteadied it after anything that goes in between. This lets you put anything in statically. So I used my text here. And you can write text along a path in Fusion. If you go to layout, the default mode is just set to point. But if you set it to path, you could create like essentially a masking spline and it will go with that. And I just separated it by spaces until it fit the way I wanted. The only thing that I would have preferred to do on here is have this say gameplay by execrated, because originally my thought was, okay, I'm transitioning out of gameplay. So I'm going to credit gameplay, then editing, then music. But the word gameplay didn't really fit on here very well without scaling the text down too much. So it would have looked off. So I stuck with editing, then did gameplay, then music. But with this, I was able to emboss it, which just kind of gives it that slight pseudo edge to it as if it's baked into the texture. And I added a small displacement here. Specifically right on the end. Now the reason for that is because this surface is not actually coplanar with everything else here. So to bend it a little, I just added the displace to almost like add a fake lens distortion, which is also the wrong application here. You can see how the D is curved. It shouldn't be, but I just wanted to offset it from this planar surface because it was supposed to be, and I didn't want to create an entire other track just to do that. But once it's all together, this is the end result you get. Oh, I forgot to mention as well, the blur mask, since I already had the mask, all I had to do was invert the alpha range over time. That's all it takes. Then for the next angle, this was a 3D camera track. And I had this weird rendering bug. When I say rendering, I don't mean my final like encoding to video export, but I mean within Resolve. I would apply my texture, and then as I went to go cache it in the edit page, it would just smoothen everything out. And I still don't know what's up with that. I had to like flush my cache, I had to like transform it in the edit page and undo it, and then maybe sometimes it would finally like cache properly. So that's an odd glitch that I don't know the solution for. But a few things going on in here. I will say this one was a little bit more complicated, but I'll go over why in a bit. But first, I mean, it has some 3D in it, so it's going to have some more native complexity to it. I did use this camera tracker, but I detached it after getting my camera solved because I didn't need it anymore. I exported all the data. So here is my scene. And this consists of a simple, but I guess badly set up 2-point light system. So if we break this down, I have my virtual camera, and this is generated from the camera solve from the 3D camera tracker. And this is piped into my merge. I created a point light that is like, a pseudo sun, and that's what's casting this light over here. And I have a bounce light because this backlight here, these textures on this side, this surface right here would have been completely black, which is not correct. There will always be some light bouncing back in multiple directions. Realistically, I should be using a 3-point light system, but again, I don't give enough of a shit, so 2-point lighting will do it for me in this case. And then I also had a texture here, which I screenshotted like here up, something with a lot of ice frozen over it so that I could apply that onto the text. And I like to grab textures from the map myself because if I want it to blend in, what better way to use it than to use the map itself? And then this was simply piped into the text 3D, and I also used a blend node to properly texture map and add a bump map to it. So here is my bump map, which is again just taken from the texture. I didn't try and like extract a custom bump map from MCC or anything like that. Fed it into the replace material. And then I also have a general directional light. And this directional light is just to give it a general brightness that is not bound to the spotlight, because otherwise this would be like way too dark. And even then, this lighting is not correct, by the way. This is just kind of a general approximation that is enough to look okay. But I didn't really try to simulate the actual 3D coordinates of all the lights and all that. That's a whole other thing. Shadow casting is also a real bitch in Fusion, so I did not do proper shadow casting. Instead, I did it once again the lazy way. So here I have the text is piped out as its own 3D render scene, and then I glow it, and then I merge it, and that's its own thing. The other side is the shadow. So all I did is I took this text and then I translated it onto the ground plane, and I simply composited it, blurred it, used a blend mode that made it look like the shadows matched the levels of the other shadows, and called it a day. So not the right way to do shadow casting, but shadow catchers are just so weird in Fusion. So that was my solution. I also used a depth map to add additional defocus behind the primary scene here, which then involved another lens blur. That's all merged on top. And then there's another lens blur at the end because I animate the blur in over time over everything. This is the same thing as the previous scene, but worse. And I will show you why. So this is a horrible workflow that I hope no one tries to replicate. I did use the camera tracker. Nothing wrong with that. I exported my data, and here's my 3D scene. So I also have a 3-point light setup on here. And you can see how it generally reconstructed the environment as needed. I intentionally chose 2 angles that would have flat floors so that I could cast shadows onto them very easily, because otherwise I would have to manually do surface reconstruction to get the displacement of the ground plane. And that's a whole other thing that I'm not going to go into right now. But I have my spotlight from below, which is meant to, again, cast some lighting onto the upper half of the text, which I guess you can't really see too much here. It's mostly on the top layer. But then there's also the spotlight from above, which is, I mean, you can see it. That's like the main light that you're getting. And once again, a directional light that just gives it a general light cast, basically like the ambient light of the map. Directional lights do not cast shadows in Fusion. You have to use spotlights. So I did the same thing with the text though. I took a texture on the wall. I think it's like right up here, basically. Isolated that. I changed the levels on it a little bit, used it as a bump map, piped it into a blend, replaced material. There you go. And then there is my text. Nothing very complicated there. It's just placed out. But here's where things get really ugly So I have multiple render passes for the text and for the shadows, but the way I did the shadows on here was way worse, and I don't even remember now why I did it this way, but it's horrible. And I'll go over why you shouldn't do it like this. So this text path is exactly as it should be. This text path is not. So why does this not have M and U included? We'll get to that in a bit, but I isolated that with a mask. And then this is my shadow path, so to speak, which is then transformed in the weirdest looking way, corner pinned, and again, put into a tracker sandwich. So this ground is stabilized, as you can see. If you look here, none of this moves because I want to put what I want to in the middle, which is a shadow. So I take the corner positioner, I blur it, I change the color of it a little bit so it matches the ground better, and then I merge it. And then on top of that, there is this light off screen and this light here, and I need that to also occlude the shadows. So it does, and therefore it's cut out. The M and the U are like over here, and they interrupt this shadow very abruptly. And I didn't feel like recoloring them properly, so I just like straight up cut it out. What I should have done is what I did in the previous angle, which by the way, I composited after this one. That's when I realized, wow, that was such a pain. I don't want to do that again. I really should have just taken this, mirrored it onto the ground plane, and then done some text skewing. Because yes, the light is not perfectly away from the text like the other one was, to where it needs to be skewed, like almost tilted, like italicized in a way. But that could have easily been done with a 3D text node. So this is just horrible workflow. Don't do that. But same thing as before though, I blurred the whole thing and then I faded it out in Fusion just to keep my effects all in one composition. I didn't want to spread it out into the edit page. But after this, all I really did was render out an intermediate pass with a mezzanine codec. Like I think I used DNX, did my motion blur, encoded it with FFmpeg to AB1, uploaded it to the montage archive, and put it on YouTube, and then I was done. I guess if you have any other questions, feel free to ask in the comments. I'm going to end this recording and get the 40 gigabytes or so of this project off my PC.